Hello everyone, today I'm going to be showing you how to measure the resistance in a wire, a bulb, a switch, anything basically. I'm going to show you how to measure resistance in anything electrical. So right here we have a basic series circuit, source, load, switches, switch, and conductors. Circuit works. Here's my meter. Move your positive lead to the volt, ohm, diode port, turn it on ohms. And right now it's reading OL, which means out of limits. So the meter's reading so much resistance that it can't show a reading because my leads aren't touching. Now if I put my leads together, you should always do this before you test a circuit to make sure your leads are good. My leads are put together. I should read 0 ohms. I do. That means my wires and my connections are all good. No resistance. So now this won't affect the reading that I'm going to get from other things. So when you measure resistance, you always want to disconnect what you're measuring from the circuit. So if I want to measure the resistance of this switch, I think it's bad, then I'm going to want to disconnect it from the circuit, because if I measure it right now, if I put my leads on there, I'm going to get the resistance of all my wires, I'm going to get the resistance of the load, and it's going to be an inaccurate reading. So I'm going to disconnect it from the circuit, connect it to my leads, and it's a basic on-off switch, so in one position it's going to read open, because that's how switches work, and when you close the switch it should be 0.1 ohms. Okay, that's acceptable. So in each of these components you want to have as little resistance as possible. Wires should typically have 0.1 ohms of resistance, a switch should have 0.1 ohms of resistance, light bulbs vary, typically they're about an ohm. The same thing would go if I wanted to measure the resistance of a wire. I would disconnect it from the circuit and I would measure the resistance, same thing as I did with the switch. And this is also the same on a vehicle. If you want to measure, say, the resistance of a fan motor, you would disconnect the connector, connect your meter leads to the fan, and it would show you how much resistance is in that motor. Depending on what you're working on, you're going to have to look up a spec and see if that's within specs. Most of the time you can tell just by looking at it if it's bad or not. So basically resistance is impedance of voltage. Voltage is used up by resistance. That's why light bulbs use voltage, because they are resistance. It's a load. And the more resistance you have, the more voltage you're going to be using. So if my ground circuit had a high amount of resistance, say so much that my meter can't read it open, then my circuit's not going to work. I'll connect the switch. It's fairly obvious. So much resistance that my light bulb won't light. If I take away that resistance, the circuit works. Another thing about measuring resistance is, if you're working on an airbag circuit, you never want to measure the resistance of an airbag, because the way the multimeter measures the resistance is it sends out a small amount of voltage and it calculates how much resistance is in the circuit by seeing how much voltage is returned. So I'm going to show you that right now. I have one meter. It's on ohms, so right now it's going to be putting out a voltage and seeing how much it gets back. And my other meter is on volts, so we're going to measure how much this meter is putting out. I'm going to put this in the ground, put this one in the ohms, and right now I'm getting half a volt. So this meter is sending out half a volt, and depending on what you're measuring, it's going to go through that. Say I'm measuring this wire, it's going to send half a volt through the wire and back through the other lead. And depending on what it gets back, it's going to show you how much resistance is in that circuit. So this is why you never want to measure airbags for resistance, because if you're measuring it for resistance, your meter is sending out a voltage, and that's how airbags are ignited. They send a voltage to the igniter, blows up the charge, and inflates the airbag. So you're going to have a bad day if you measure the resistance of an airbag. Yes, you can measure the resistance of airbag circuits, but like I said before, you want to always disconnect them from the main circuit. The same goes for control modules. When you're measuring resistance on control modules, some don't recommend that you do it because you can damage the control module by sending a voltage into it. So you just want to be sure before you measure the resistance of it that it's acceptable.